So thank you very much, Barbara and Jacopo, for being with us. As I just mentioned, you have been among the most popular hosts on our own conferences. I will start because I've been so requested for many colleagues from External Action Service. Thank you for the article that you have published. I don't know if everyone was glad about it, but I can confirm that the staff was really glad about it. Also because thanks to your article, we have all discovered Vice President Callas. That is exactly what staff was expecting to hear from her. Really blunt sentence and clear messages addressed to the staff. So we really are grateful for the clarification that been made. Whatever the project is, whose responsibility would eventually be. I mean, what is crucial and what is important is to see the Vice President confirming on behalf of the Commission that the Commission wants to work with all delegations. There is no downside project. So it's important for our colleagues that they are struggling in the delegation, especially for those that were supposed to be fired, to be in a way at least reassured that the Vice President of the Commission will stay with them, standing also for their rights. Coming to the content of the meeting today, I think last time we were discussing about the results of the European elections, and now we have the new Commission appointed. All the hearings were more or less with no shocking results. So I would like to get your views because you were there looking at all these hearings and political games in the Parliament. Which is your assessment about the process that made the Commission to be appointed a few days ago? Thank you.
Hi, I'm happy to start. Thank you for having us again here and to talk to you. And like last time, we look forward to especially answering your questions instead of the two of us talking, because usually we're the ones asking the questions. So we're not really used to this format, but we'll do our best. When it comes to your specific question, yes, it has been a really long time since the EU has been in this internal phase, right? First, a campaign leading up to the European Parliament elections, the elections and the process. And now finally, since December, it feels like, okay, we can really get started on the policy making. And if you look back to that process, we had the top job process in the council, which went relatively smoother than initially expected, also because of the political situation in France at that point. The one now is also interesting but different. And then when it came to the hearings in the European Parliament, it's true that a lot of people obviously expected at least one or two commissioners to fall. And it was very interesting to see Politico obviously has been following this really closely. We've covered all the live blogs. We talked about all the drama between the different groups in the European Parliament, but you could have perfectly not have paid attention for a couple of weeks and nothing would have changed, right? We now have this full commission that has started. No one has fallen, but at the same time, we do get a sense that there has been some damage done in the relationships between the different groups in the European Parliament, specifically between the Socialists and the EP. And now then it's interesting to see how they will start maybe fighting each other. So the dynamic, because it's so EPP dominated, that everything will be fine and that we can just kind of have a steady course. And maybe I'll stop there and pass it on to you on this specific part before we go into the Trump.
Just add a few points, starting from the story on the external service. We are happy that the story worked well, just because these plans seem pretty crazy to us. At the same time, I've noticed the level of among member states when I was interviewing the Portuguese foreign minister last week, and all of a sudden, before I asked him the question about it, he started unleashing his anger for these plans. Of course, we are talking about small and medium-sized member states. The big ones don't care much. But and also then after we ran the story, I got several requests for member states to share documents, something that I couldn't do, obviously, but at the same time, it was an evidence of how much member states also have been kept in the dark. And this, of course, is another element that doesn't really help those crazy plans to go ahead, luckily. So, second point on the hearing, what happened to Didier Reynders shows at the same time how these hearings are kind of are really sometimes don't really have the nails often to cut the meat. What happened to Didier Reynders was largely expected. There was a book published years ago by Mark van Haas, full of documents explaining many things that were that needed to be looked at properly. But of course, everything that happened only after he left office, everybody's innocent until proven guilty. So we will see what happens. Will happen there. But at the same time, it's an indication that that something doesn't really work properly. Probably. The very last point that Barbara mentioned on the EPP, there are now we are at 11 EPP prime ministers. European Council plus 4 in coalition. In March, there probably will be 12 EPP. This is expected somehow, if Germany will get will also go to the CDU, to probably soften the push towards the far right. But at the same time, as we know, the business in this town is that nobody can be hegemonic. And so there are already talks in town on how much the DPP will be united and how much actually, for example, for someone like Antonio Costa, who is a socialist in charge of the European Council, was the risk of being just rubber-stamping decisions from EPP leaders, and how much he can actually play among the divisions among them. There are already signs, growing signs that it's not is not a monolith. But of course, you know, when you don't have an external enemy, internal cannibalization is largely expected. But so for the time being, I stop here, and I thank you very much for this invitation, and I hope that our chat will be useful.
Yeah, we are already now 200, so we are growing. And thank you very much again for your intervention. Yeah, I mean, everyone seems to be afraid about what you mentioned, is this council to be politically so solid for one political group. And the other concern that colleagues are expecting is to have a really difficult time whenever a project must be submitted to the parliament, because we don't know exactly on which majority the commission can eventually rely, especially on the fact that they are linked to the Trump expected activities. How do you see the change in the United States to interfere with the weakness of some among most important member states? Is a chance for the Commission, for the European project to be stronger? So far, everyone was more or less afraid that the strongest member states were not in favor of having a strong Commission, a strong European Parliament. So the fact that there are some political crises around could make the European institution stronger.
I think you saw in the first term of von der Leyen that she obviously stepped into this power vacuum that was left by the member states when it came to some of the crises that we had in the first time. And so you could expect her to try to do that again, especially when it comes to trade, for example. She went to Mercosur last week, despite the big French resistance on that trade deal. She stood there shaking hands with the Mercosur leaders. And when it comes to dealing with Trump, obviously the main pillars will be trade, will be defense, security, and competitiveness, which are issues that von der Leyen is pretty active on. So I do expect her to be even more, stepping even more in that in that field. The question is, of course, how much Trump will allow that to happen. He doesn't really like the EU as an interlocutor. He's not particularly fond of Germans. He's not particularly fond of women. So she may not be the best person to interact with if we want to make sure that we get concessions from this new US administration. And it was very interesting to see what happened over the weekend, that you have a France that is totally in political crisis. And still Macron sits there with Zelensky on one hand, on one side, and Trump on the other side. So this tension between member states and the Commission, especially when it comes to foreign policy, especially when it comes to security, which Jacopo knows much better, will probably continue in the next couple of years. And the big thing for us to look at will also be to see how much Trump will be able to divide and conquer within the EU, right? He tried that very much last time around, hitting certain countries with tariffs on sensitive goods. Now, especially when the stakes are so much higher because of NATO, because of Ukraine, you can expect that he will again try to push certain countries in one direction and try to divide the EU. And that sense of unity that every EU leader now says, it's so important to make sure that we keep united, that unity prevails when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to the EU, will be interesting to see when the first cracks in that unity will start to appear.
The point is that I agree entirely with Barbara, and here the question that, I mean, it's a strong question also diplomatic level. It's whether Trump is that crisis, Jean Monnet style, that the EU needs to take a step further, or whether it will start reaching out to member states saying, okay, I lower you the tariffs if you don't buy European and you keep on buying my stuff. If he starts playing this kind of game, you know, each country, if it's confronted with a question that is either security or your security or the EU, then it would be a very strong dilemma, but with a pretty easy answer for many member states. Now a discussion in town is who's going to be the bridge. Who's going to be the one that, as Barbara says, from the line is a woman, but especially she's seen as close to Biden. And so a German woman close to Biden doesn't really fit the profile of the bridge. And so other names are floating around. Of course, the main one is Mark Rutte. He is not a part of the European Union, but he has been sitting in the European Council for 13 years. And is considered one of the best position, among the best positions to have some say, some way at least to convince Trump. Other names floating around are, of course, Donald Tusk, because of Poland, because how much Trump is close, interested in Poland. We all remember for Trump during the previous administration, but of course here the question is that Tusk is not Duda, but on the one hand, the defense expenditure of Poland puts it in a very good position to play that role, but at the same time, again, Donald Tusk is clearly and luckily not the same thing as Duda. Then there is a question on Giorgia Meloni. We saw the pictures on during the weekend of her talks with Donald Trump, and of course, she, on the one hand, she's well positioned. She's close to Moscow, and in 2021, she was the only one invited to the big Republican conference there in Washington. But at the same time, with defense expenditure at 144, it's not exactly coherent with the Trump push on increasing defense expenses.
Yeah, I think defense policy is one of the items that everyone is looking at. Can Europe be able to build a strong common defense policy when now Trump is just cutting or announcing to cut their contribution to the defense expenses? Do you see that to be possible to be a European policy, or each and every member states will go more or less by itself?
Okay, if we take, I don't know how familiar our listeners are with the discussion on EPF, the European Peace Facility, but there are 6.6 billion that have been blocked for over 1 year. that system it's it's intergovernmental, and it's a 27, and is often used an example of how it's difficult to actually for the EU to go ahead at 27. And so there is a fear that, but that was already before Trump election, there was a fear that defense will actually increase the fragmentation of member states. So member states going in different directions with regional projects instead of projects at 27. So it is going to be one of the major challenges, but it's true that NATO can only blame countries if they don't reach 2%, and in the future 2.5 or 3. Let's see what will be agreed, as the EU has the tools to help countries to increase these expenditures. So even beyond the debate on defense bonds, there is also a discussion on whether the EU will be willing to actually help member states to reach 2%, which can be unfair for the countries that have already reached 2%. But of course, the EU will be very is in the position to be the ones that to be the institution that can help financially this discussion. There on defense bonds, that's the other thing, whether there will be another recovery fund or not. Of course, the EU cannot leverage, cannot borrow money for everything, and there are limits on the rating, and so it cannot that it keep on borrowing money. So even if tomorrow the Dutch and the Germans will be on board, let's see what will happen with Merz. But my point is, even if there will be this agreement at 27 to go ahead with the defense bonds. First of all, if Germany will find 500 billion, probably will spend it for his Bundeswehr, for his own army that is in a pretty difficult situation, and so it needs very much money. First of all, at the national level, and then there will be probably something else at EU level. But here there are many ideas. Here one idea a day on how to find the money. And so it's, I believe that Andres Kubilius and Kaja Kallas and Bjorn, because as far as I know, it's not just the two of them, will all be busy trying to collect these ideas and trying to see what makes sense.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat if we could expect a new austerity policy with the new commission also in order to find eventually money somewhere, or austerity is now over because everyone has understood that it's not a good recipe for dealing with concerns.
Yeah, I think it depends a bit on the question if you mean austerity within in what context, but maybe just to broaden it out, you see that one of the big fights that a lot of countries are already gearing up for now is the next MFF proposal, right? So first the discussion within the Commission, which will be already quite of a discussion, and then the discussion on it in the European Council. And already before Trump came in, you obviously had all these challenges coming up: competitiveness, green transition, security, even more now, and then the need to square that with countries who don't want to give more to the EU, every discussion on own resources that is really, really sensitive, and then the discussion that Jacopo described when it comes to, okay, then maybe we should start thinking about a next generation EU or more joint borrowing, and then the sensitivities that comes along with. So that will be one of the big fights in the coming years. Austerity in a different context, if it comes to the GSP rules, etc. I don't think much will change more about that. It will be the big thing to look into will just be how will the EU now deal with France and the French budget, or same with other governments who haven't sent their budgets yet, like Belgium, and how will they make sure that the new rules that they have set in place will actually be implemented.
And of course, we will need to see what will happen with France. I mean, a deficit of 6.1, the debt is, I don't remember, something like 1112, I don't remember the exact figure, but so in this moment, there is a lot of anxiety for what is going to happen over there, but I think it's too early to have any kind of meaningful prediction.
There is a comment that I do share, that the role of the press, including journalists like Politico, doing in-depth reporting on boring, complex processes, a key ingredient for the functioning of European democracy. So credit to you. and is much better actually than in some member states on which it's not that easy to get articles freely as you do. So we really work you. I already mentioned several times that during days, whenever there is the discussion about can we take the risk to breach some rules, the question is always, what about an article on Politico? And then could be stand for the decision. Then everyone comes to the heart saying, okay, let's work by the book. And it's crucial. So you are actually our auditors, internal audit service, anti-fraud service, whatever you consider to be your role. Yeah, there is a question about the role of Rutte that Jacopo has mentioned. He could be the one being really the ambassador to Trump, and then switching from the Council and from the EU institution more to the NATO as an ambassador to Trump.
That's exactly. I mean, for the time being, it seems that the best position because of what I said before about Tusk and Meloni. Then at the same time, there are differences now, big differences on the relationship between Weber and Schuman. Now, when you cross to the other side of the city and you go there to briefings, they increasingly talk about Schuman. And for example, in these days about what is going on with ADIP in Coreper. And so Rutte, of course, is not a EU leader, but it's true that I mean, personally, I notice a different atmosphere already between the two institutions, and this is something. And this is something on which leaders could try to cash in. I mean, when at the last the last meeting of defense ministers, he told them stop speaking about Trump, try to speak with him. Then some ministers, very much on the records, said that the leaders actually reach out to him, and those who did were talking about. I don't know whether you saw that interview with Olaf Scholz to the Süddeutsche Zeitung 2 weeks ago. It was a Saturday morning, two Saturdays ago. 2 weeks ago, and Scholz said that in that interview that he was surprised by how nuanced was, positively surprised by how nuanced was Trump in his conversation, and those who spoke to me after that FAC defense told me pretty much the same thing. That over the phone, the reaction, the way he was talking about Ukraine and so on was surprising, meaning also in their case more nuanced, more well prepared, pretty different from the way he comes across when he speaks publicly. What this will mean, we don't know yet. But at least, this means that this process of reaching out is actually happening, and of course would be interesting to see who else can actually come to the fore in the next months. How Costa, for example, which will be the role of Antonio Costa in all of this? On the one hand, he's a socialist, but on the other hand, he comes from one of the most Atlanticist countries in the EU. Portugal was so key that in 1949, despite the Italian dictatorship, was allowed within NATO, and which shows how important is Portugal for American interest. And so also it would be interesting to see which role Costa will be able to play with his Portuguese hat. And then there are jokes whether Trump knows where is Portugal, but that's another matter.
He could discover it. You know, we are always working a lot with the Ukrainian refugees that we are helping with different initiatives, and so we are normally requested to provide some guess how the things could evolve. And it's evident that today the question is about the link between what is happening in Syria and what could be eventually the consequence for Ukrainian war. Do you see any I know that it's impossible now to guess, things are too fresh. But which is your guess globally, Trump, Syria, majority in the parliament, about the evolution of the Ukrainian war?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with, if I can sideline a little bit, because we were talking about Syria today. Obviously, yes, it exposes Russia, which could have consequences for Ukraine. The first reaction we had is, what does it mean for the EU's migration debate, right? Because we saw at the October European Council how more and more there was this convergence around the European Council table when it comes to tackling migration, especially now that Germany has shifted more to the right, also after the European Parliament elections, and how much of a push that there was to not just manage the migration flows once people arrive here in Europe, but also when it comes to returns. And there was a big push from Italy, Austria, and other couple of countries to try to send migrants who didn't get asylum in the EU, to send them back to certain spots in Syria, because it was deemed as not as a safe country, but certain areas were deemed as a safe region. Obviously, that whole discussion on Syria will change now, but the question is also, does it influence the broader discussion on returns, and how countries that are maybe deemed safe at one point can totally shift. So that was the first reaction that we had this morning. Maybe you want to say anything on Russia and the Ukraine war?
Yeah, I mean, there is a big difference between the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict in Ukraine, which is the fact that in the Middle East, we Europeans don't play a big role. We are so divided that it's complicated every time at FAC level to find a common line, and our attempts in the past to play a bigger role there in the Middle East didn't work very well. So that's mainly something for the Americans, as Ukraine is mainly something for us. And meaning here on Ukraine, the unity so far has been found, and there is for the time being no sign that this will change. We saw what happened, but we saw at the same time what happened in Romania, and which is another indication of how fragile also this consensus can be when Putin starts playing certain games. So so far the two crises have two different paths: unity on one side, disunity on the other side, a possibility for the EU to play a role on one side, and not the same thing in the Middle East. But now this whole thing will it's entirely intertwined with other questions, which is, of course, how much if the Europeans will be able to fill any kind of gap in Ukraine, if for real the Trump administration will cut military aid. That's the key question. And on the one hand, on the other hand, there in Syria, we saw certain comments here among leaders. How good is that Assad has left? But we know that these judgments can completely change if in a couple of weeks we find out that that country has ended up in the hands of a terrorist group. Very last point. The Greeks were already afraid before the Trump election that of the implications there in the region for Erdogan. Erdogan has had in the past close ties with Trump. The Greeks were able to offset these ties thanks to Mike Pompeo, and there were concerns in that area that the new Trump administration would be, for Erdogan, would have been a green light for its Ottoman ambitions. And so a key question here is whether what happened in Syria is the first sign of Turkey, Erdogan, who thinks that he can play a bigger role there in the region, and how then this can affect this stronger Turkey can affect the relationship with Russia. We know that in the past Turkey tried to play the peace broker there in over Ukraine. Many others tried, also the Indians. So I don't want to open the chapter, but it's just to say that that probably the EU will have to confront itself with a much stronger Turkey and with an Erdogan unleashed in its ambitions in the region, and this could also have some impacts over the whole migration discussion.
Yeah, linked to that, there is a question if whether EU is ready to have a more active foreign policy.
That's $1 million question. No, it's the question that we also asked a lot of people before the US elections, right? If Trump comes back to the White House, is it an opportunity for the EU? Is it the crisis moment that the EU needs to get moving on certain things? Or is it such a big risk because of the security implications and because of the divide and conquer tactics? What you do see now with this new mandate and the trio that there is, with von der Leyen, Costa, and Callas, who know each other well, who portray this image of, we get along, we will make sure that the interinstitutional relations work. Yes, there is a lot of overlap when it comes to foreign policy, just based on the job descriptions, but we will make sure that we and our teams navigate this so that we really have this kind of this clear message toward the rest of the world. But that is, of course, kind of the honeymoon period in the beginning of the mandate, and it will be put to the test really, and it is already kind of put to the test with Syria now, and with Trump as well. So there's definitely an opportunity to have a more active foreign policy. Jacopo has been covering this much longer than I have, and I think is a little bit more pessimistic probably on whether it will actually materialize or not.
No, I mean, the Estonian defense minister told me, when I asked him the question, told me, oh, but the EU has the money for it. And he mentioned, the overall figure, the 3 trillions that the EU overall spent on energy to recover with the COVID pandemic. But, here, first of all, I've never seen this level of pessimism in town in the last weeks and months. There is a level of pessimism that is pretty widespread. It's not only countries that are on the eastern border, but also other countries and also bigger countries. And but that's because what this commission has to tackle, it's pretty astonishing if you look at the whole perspective, because not only the EU is behind on all the key technologies, on AI, on chips, on electric vehicles, but it's we touch upon also when we discussed it the last time, but it's but then at the same time he has to tackle the energy prices now that the major energy partner Russia is not anymore such a partner, the defense issue because of the Americans looking to the Pacific, the China issue because China is not anymore the market that used to be, and at the same time we have all the biggest economies in the EU that are in a bad shape. It's not just France but also Germany, also Italy. I mean, Spain is a little bit better, but all the rest. So if you put together all these challenges, and with the economic situation at the same time, it's clear why there is this level of pessimism. What has so far been was the attempt was to try to be pessimist on the short term to see the issues, optimist on the long term to find the solutions. Is this second part that in this moment is sometimes missing?
Yeah, and maybe to add on that was obviously the big difference with the first Trump presidency, when the world and the EU was so surprised and so shocked, nobody had seen this coming, etc. This time around was totally different, right? And so we kept hearing also in the months leading up to it, we're preparing, there was this task force in the commission, we make sure that we're ready for all the scenarios. Then when it happens and we ask all the questions, okay, what now? What is going to happen? Where are the preparations? What have the commission briefed you on? What is going on within the commission? It turns out to be, that even some of the ambassadors tell us, well, actually, we don't know either, and doesn't feel like a lot of has actually been prepared. On trade, we saw the carrot of LNG, but, if we can see through it, then surely Washington can see through it to it as well. And when it comes to the really, really core issue of security and defense financing, the divergences are still so big that it's hard to see how they will overcome out of that in the short term. And we walked out of a meeting together with one of the key players, so depressed and so pessimistic.
Yes.
That maybe we were too naive beforehand, but you know.
We needed a drink after
We
needed a drink after the meeting. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, what makes a really unpopular European institution in the member states, I mean, of part of the citizen, is the Green Deal and the consequence now, especially on automotive industry. I mean, in Italy is a disaster. Thousands of people fired because we can no longer go with a normal engine. Which is your guess about the Green Deal? Because the Green Deal has been confirmed. We have seen the president to get as advisor the former head of the political group of Green in the parliament, but still in the parliament there are some clear resistance about it. Which is the evolution on your views of the Green? We are going slowly, we are going to stop it, we are going to keep as it was.
Yeah, I think if you take a step back when it comes to the overall climate target, it's very, very clear that von der Leyen has this vision of we want to stick to it no matter what happens, right? Even when you think back about the energy crisis and gas prices and the enormous political pressure from populations throughout Europe, you thought it was almost impossible to match that with the Green Deal ambitions, and they did, right? Because it was so important for them to make sure that those targets were being kept, and that the energy crisis was used almost as an opportunity to get more into renewables. Again, within the EPP, despite the pressure throughout the campaign, the targets remain. And von der Leyen has been really clear about that. The people that are in charge of that, whether it's her climate advisor in the cabinet, whether it's the head of DG Klima, all those people that are pretty fond believers of these climate targets are also still in place and are likely to stay in place throughout the second term. But then if you look into, okay, how do we get to these targets, the actual implementation, you do see this shift towards, we go from being like a Green Deal climate commission to being a competitive commission, right? Especially in the second term. So the challenge for them, and you see that even in the words of Clean Industrial Deal, those words, right? Yes, it has to be an industrial deal. At the same time, you want to make sure that you put your climate target into that. And that kind of delicate balance is what this commission in the second term is trying to achieve. And the question will be how much, especially if the economic numbers are going more down, and if there's even more pressure, for example, from the automotive industry and you saw that, for example, sorry, I'm jumping from one thing to the other, but I thought it was really, really telling that last week, in the first week of this new commission, you have Ribera, you have Séjourné going to a plant of ArcelorMittal, which is, a steel, it's almost old industry, right? That is trying to shift to new industry. Who's threatening the commission, like, we will pull out jobs from this company unless you change your climate ambitions. And then in the first week of the mandate, you have two of the key commissioners going there and trying to have this conversation with industry and trying to reassure them it's not because we have these really ambitious climate targets that we don't also care about your competitiveness. And that balance will be really hard, especially with this European Parliament that will try to water down some of the climate commitments.
Yeah, it goes against, the zeitgeist doesn't go exactly in the direction of the Green Deal. But so if we just take it from that, but, I've been covering EU politics for 9 years here at Politico. Then I switched to do more defense. And one of the reasons is because I was speaking too much to diplomats and officials, and they needed also to speak more to industry, and to avoid, if you spend too much time in the bubble, you risk mistaking your aquarium for the sea. And now that I speak regularly to the industry, one of the lines that they keep on saying is, the joke, the US innovates, the EU regulates, the Chinese plan. and this is a joke that floats around at industry level, but also there I've never seen such a level of concern for what the Commission is doing. There are certain of the records with industry officials that are devastating in terms of what they think that the Commission has been doing the last years in terms of regulating too much, too badly, and so on. And the Green Deal, it's part also of this, that now they want to see a change. You saw the data, how big was the US economy compared to the EU economy 10, 15 years ago. You see how is it now, and you see all the stories on how Elon Musk will be impossible in the EU, and so the Green Deal, competitiveness, all of these come to this into this background of okay, guys, either we stop being the place that over-regulates, or we would just be the losers. And so it's not just, my point is not just the political zeitgeist that goes against it, but also when you switch and you speak to the industry people, the things that you hear are pretty astonishing.
Colleagues, you are invited to put your question in the chat. The chat is not going to be published, so especially because I see some question that I'm sure our president is not going to be so happy about it. The question is it the right person to navigate in this trouble, and with the reference with the texting privately? I mean, let's put it otherwise. We are. It is clear there is now a strong governance at the central level by the president towards the rest of the Commission on everything. I think it is good for the accountability. Sorry, we know who is responsible. Some services are afraid that they will lose their margin of maneuver, that procedure can be slowed down in the light of the past. There will be less initiative because everything seems to be centralized. I mean, again, for us, accountability is a key factor. Now we know that if something is wrong, we know to whom we must address our complaint. In the past, it was really a challenge to understand who was in charge of something. But in a way, it is a good move. On the other hand, it's true that the feeling around the services is we have to wait until there is a green light from the Parliament. And there is no personality so far among the commissioners who seems to be the nasty guy in town. Is it the same feeling that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, there are two layers to this, right? Ahead of the election, when von der Leyen was speaking about the second mandate, she kept saying, she wanted the capitals to send a man and a woman, but that the most important thing was that she would have strong commissioners with executive experience, people that could really own certain files and took charge of certain files. And between the lines, it was interpreted as, I don't want another, when it turns out there's a health crisis, I don't want a health commissioner who turns out to be completely useless. And then then the capitals started sending their people, usually not a man and a woman, as a kind of a middle finger to von der Leyen. But then it also turned out that it weren't the heavyweights that she was expected. And the last layer to that was the new organigram of the Commission, right? Which, and I'm trying to phrase my words, at a certain point, we were criticizing it and making fun of it. And at a certain point, someone in the Berlaymont said, you don't have to see this as a power grab. I said, well, how can you not see it as a power grab? It has everything. It has every element of a power grab. And the organigram, it's so much overlap that people are still trying to figure out who is in charge of which file, what will be the cooperation, how will the cooperation work, etc. That in the end, it will always come down to two people, a president and Bjorn. So in that sense, the expectation is that the second term will be even more centralized. I do think that maybe we don't have to underestimate the figure of Teresa Ribera, in the sense that not only, you know, is she the key socialist person in this new commission, does she have an important portfolio, but also given her reputation as a politician in Spain, also her work on the international front for climate, that she's very much has the reputation of someone who really understands the political game, who really builds relationships to then make things happen, and uses them for her own advantage, political advantage, not to say it in a negative way. So I think when it comes to the person that will be able to challenge von der Leyen, not per se be the nasty person, but to challenge von der Leyen, at least be a little bit on the same political level, that is the first obvious one to watch. And then I'm sure there are certain surprises that at this point we don't see yet, but that could maybe turn out to be, you know, to be a person, a commissioner that is actually not afraid to, at a certain point, also challenge the power of the president. But you do see this difference in the first term and the second term, is that now the new commissioners and their teams, what they're trying to find out is, how can we manage a relationship with the 13th floor? What do we need to do to manage this relationship? Which I think is something that the outgoing commissioners only started to realize throughout their term, that was the key thing that they needed to get their job done, to say it in a bit of a cynical way.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it seems that we're still stuck to the question of Thomas Mann 50 years ago, whether Germany has to become European or Europe to become German. But there is another layer. I fully agree with everything Barbara was saying. I just had another layer that is a personal concern that has been like that in the last years, which is whether all of these could imply a loss of competence for the Commission. When recently, months ago, I met these lobbyists who told me, "Oh, as a citizen, I'm unhappy, but as a lobbyist, I'm happy because everything I send then becomes regulation." This is not the story that I like to hear. Sorry, we still have some European dreams, and we just hope that the Commission will have all the competence that are needed to be fully on top of the files and to represent the public interest, and not to be and not to fall victim of private interest. I say this because, again, I go back to the zeitgeist. Can you imagine how the far right would be happy to see a weaker Commission exposed more and more to this kind of thing? So it's something. I'm not saying. I'm just saying it's something on which we will keep our eyes very open on the files to be sure that all of these doesn't imply, doesn't mean any kind of loss of competence. It's impossible for one or two people to be on top of everything, and what's at stake goes beyond the Commission and is much wider.
Mm.
Yeah, I think, yeah, good.
No, maybe if I can switch the topic to the Trump question, because I thought it was really interesting. Someone asking if the fears about Trump are not overdone, that he has already won the debate to a certain extent on certain things. Because I do think that it's an interesting discussion in the sense that right after the election, and we saw that with the European leaders going to Budapest for the informal European Council, that, you know, Trump had barely said anything after the election, and already, you know, people were trying to make concessions or ouvertures. You had Rutte who were saying, you know, it's better if we all go to 3%. You had von der Leyen who was saying, you know, we should thinking about selling more LNG to the US. You had other national capitals already thinking about, okay, what can we offer him so that he doesn't hit us back? So in that sense, I think there, and if you look at it from a broader perspective, the whole discussion about should the EU still follow the multilateral rules of the WTO if the US and China are not doing it anymore, should we still stick to being the only good pupil in the class when no one else is doing it anymore? That is very much something that goes back to the 2016 first Trump administration. So there is definitely in that sense, I think you definitely have a point that Trump has already won part of the debate, but at the same time, I don't think that the fears about Trump are overdone, in the sense that we do have to take into account that if he actually will do some of the things that he has said during the campaign, then the EU is in such a big mess on security, yes, but also on trade, and not just because of the 10 to 12% tariffs on EU goods, but also on the tariffs on Chinese goods, and what that would then mean for Chinese goods flowing into the European market, especially if we stick to the trade rules that we have now. So I don't think the fears are overdone, because as we saw in the first time, you never know with this guy, and so you have to at least take the worst possible scenarios into account.
Yeah. Coming back to the loss of confidence that Jacopo was referring to, what we have always been really glad to see on your articles, that you don't start mentioning that you are bloody bureaucrats, overpaid, not doing nothing, challenging the salary that for some of us are important, no doubt about it. Because what we are now facing, it seems to be quite crazy to be mentioned, that is a lack of attractiveness on our civil service. You have been publishing articles in this respect, and there is a lack of young candidates, and there is also a geographical imbalance. Because among the dreams of our self-regulation, there is the idea of not imposing national quota whenever you recruit staff, but still looking at the geographical balance, because we all understand that if the composition of the staff is not balanced, we cannot be credible towards the member states that are not so represented. And if we don't manage to find the French, German, Nordic candidates, because the conditions that we are offering are not attractive enough in comparison of their market. And we cannot live with a reserve list of only Italians, Romanian, Bulgarian, Greek, and whatever. So and we were really glad, and we have also provided our contribution to your articles on this respect. And we were wondering if this lack of presence of some member states, of this lack of capacity to recruit the younger staff, is something that you also see with your discussion with member states. Because I mean, we think that we all know that they are so interested in director generals, but they also understand that if you don't have your own citizen to be recruited in the lower grades, you cannot just parachuting director. In any case, if you just jump in a DGA with no experience whatsoever in our own functioning, it's clear that you are not going to be effective, and you need the years before understanding what is going on. So it's crucial for them to recruit their own citizen, and your articles were right on this respect. But I would like to understand if in the council you see the same concern, because we are afraid of an eventual new reform, and we are afraid that we could downgrade again and even further the condition, and then we have even further problems on this respect.
Yes, I mean, the Baltics, for example, I've always felt underrepresented in many fields, and now, for example, they think that the external service they will be more fairly balanced, and there are expectations that the external service, the number of Italians and Spaniards will go down, and so it's something that comes up regularly in conversations, but also with other countries that talk about issues that their civil servants prefer to remain at the national level, not just because of salaries, but also because of dynamics. So it's something that, I mean, navigating the European bureaucracy is something very different than navigating the national one. And so recently we had, but we can disclose it, of course, a lunch, a coffee, sorry, a breakfast, a kind of a piece of cake with an ambassador who was talking about how complicated for his country to find the right people here, and it's a rich small country, but even for them it's difficult. And recently I was surprised. I was at an event, and there were this group of students who just graduated from an Italian university, and when I asked them whether they wanted to join the commission, their point was entirely on smart working. because they told me we started working, half wearing our pajamas. It's a generational thing, and half wearing pajama and half wearing who work from the Bahamas on their laptop, so they confront themselves with this kind of reality, and so I was expecting them to tell me, yes, let's get into the institutions ASAP, but no, that wasn't the answer I got, and they didn't mention the salaries again. They mention smart working as one of the key issues for them. So attractiveness is not necessarily only pensions and salary, but are increasingly for that generation the conditions of work.
I'm so glad to hear it, because I will share with you a leaflet that we have sent around that is exactly on this respect, because we were in contact with young colleagues and even national administration, and also with the colleagues in the commission that they are in charge of recruitment, and they are all confirmed that the first question raised by candidates is not about salary and pension, it's about working conditions, smart working and respect. And it's a good privilege to be half in pajama, as I'm today. It's not actually a pajama. Let's say it is more a sportwear. And I understand that you are not that easy to renounce it. But I mean, this kind of conversation with the young colleagues is crucial in order to avoid that we go along with a new very bad reform, again downgrading the conditions for recruitment of our own colleagues. I wanted to finally ask you, we had a clear feeling in the past, which was not a feeling, it was a reality, of a bad relationship between our president and President Michel. We see now perhaps the trio working much more together with also the president of the parliament, who is more or less announced to become eventually in 5 years our own president of the commission. So how do you see this trio, two ladies, strong ladies, and the poor Costas to be the only man dealing the European affairs together?
Yeah, like I said, they're still in the honeymoon period, right? So now all the briefings that we get is they love each other, they know each other so well, it will all be great, they'll have bi-weekly meetings, etc. When it comes to Costa and Fidel, one of the questions will be how much of the bad relationship between Michel and von der Leyen was only Michel's fault, and how much, what was her skin in the game? Yes, Michel fucked up, definitely, but she wasn't innocent either. And I think the Costa team is very well aware, like they want to play their part, but that also means that von der Leyen also has to play her part, especially because, von der Leyen, as we said, is now so powerful and is a really comfortable position. So they also have to take into account that Costa and Kallas will also want to play their role, as they should, given their jobs and their institutions. And so how much space will they give each other will be one of the questions. And with Costa, I think we should definitely not underestimate him and how smart he is in playing that game, even though, as we said, he, as a socialist, is very much in the minority in the European Council, will probably be even more in the minority in the years to come. With Kallas, it'll be, what she did with Sannino landed really, really badly. And so the start of her mandate, where there were already so many questions about will she not be too pro-Russia? Does she have enough experience when it comes to foreign policy with the rest of the world? Then, Sannino out, then the story we discussed on the EIS delegations, which, even though it happened before her time, she now has to clean up this mess. She went to the European Parliament, where she said that she discussed this, that she called von der Leyen on it. Maybe not the smartest thing to disclose your phone calls with the president ahead of MEP. So there's already a little bit of a sense of like, don't get overconfident in your first weeks into the job if you want to make it work in Brussels.
Yeah, and
or am I being too harsh?
No. You're absolutely fair, and there are open questions on, for example, whether Costa will make 5 years or only half of them. and there are already rumors of Mitsotakis, who would be very keen to replace him in 2.5 years' time, especially if for real the socialist will be left only in Spain, Malta, and not very much else. And that's something else that can change, of course, the dynamics. If Costa needs then to find a way to avoid this EPP trap, to find a way out and to get renewed for another 2.5 years, then what can he do? He can probably team up more with Parliament. But then if you move to Parliament, you have a similar question on Metsola. I mean, the rumors that Metsola wants to be the next on the line are very strong, and so also there, how much all these fights for survival and this level of ambition will come to the fore, in which way is something that will be pretty interesting to watch, and we will buy lots of popcorn.
Yeah, it's clear that in the eyes of the staff, President Metsola has a really social dimension and a standing for the staff, because at the end she has also the power to do it because it's the budgetary authority. The last story that we just have supported is the budget for the housing allowance in Luxembourg. There seems to be something that we are going to face even in the future. So the Commission proposed the budget, the Council refused the budget, the Parliament wants to get the budget, the Council cut other institutions in order to provide the Parliament with a budget for the housing allowance, only for the staff of the Parliament, and then the Parliament put its veto in order to get the staff for all institutions in Luxembourg, how it is the case today. It is also clear that the Commission can propose, and the Parliament has much more power when it comes to deal with the financial perspective. And everyone in town is afraid about what could come up with the financial perspective. Final question, which is, yes, are we going to get a budget or we are going to go austerity and cut of the budget? All is asking to do more with less.
An MFF budget, you mean?
Yeah, or, MFF, yes.
Oh,
MFF,
yeah. Yeah. Well, there will be a budget eventually. Kind of budget.
I mean, to imagine in this moment of nationalist rise that these governments will open the wallets in the midst of a rise of nationalist parties, in the midst of economic woes, it's complicated. Then at the same time, I understand that there are certain figures floating in town of a 2.3 trillion MFF needed, which is simply the 1.2 of the current one plus the Draghi report split in 7 years. When you hear these figures, then what you don't hear is solutions to find this money. And so I would more incline to think that unless they pull a rabbit out of the hat, they would be to do more with less rather than I don't see in this moment around such an enthusiasm in saying, oh yes, let's increase the budget. It's true also that in this moment, member states that are on the border with Russia have a different kind of view compared to those that don't, and so there could be a push also because again of defense and security, with the others staying a little bit behind. But again, on joint borrowing, there are the limits we said before. You cannot borrow whatever you want. There are limits before losing the credit rating, and there is a different geographical view on according where you are on the needs and the priorities. That has always been the case. But I go back to a previous point. This time there is so much at stake that either the Commission and member states get it right or inshallah.
Okay, I think that inshallah is the closing word that we can all share. I can only thank you again for your intervention, so praised by our own colleagues. I can only say see you again for a new conference in a few months, and whenever there is something to discuss, even if with you, is always a pleasure to discuss. We could discuss for hours and hours. So thank you very much for your work, for what you do. We have seen our colleague to thank you for your watchdog mission and you see also the colleagues thank you on the chat. So again, the chat is not going to be published. So the one who is relating to the text mix of the president is not going to be discovered. And then thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Bye bye.
Bye.